Kia ora and welcome. It's great to have you here. Today we're going to consider one of the most radical passages in the Bible, and this is the story of Jesus' followers and how they lived in light of the fact that the person that they had followed had died and come back from the dead. How did it change their entire world? Reminds me a little bit of that lotto ad you see on what would you do if you won $8 million? What would you do? How would your life be changed? Well, how would your life be changed if someone that you had met, that you had followed, someone who had been executed for being a rebel against a corrupt system, someone who'd offered a new type of teaching on how to live in the world, how would you act if this person who died came back to life? Would it change your life? Would it change how you interacted with the world? There was an ad in 2007 and it said this: dance like no one's watching, sing like no one's listening, love like you've never been hurt, work like you own the company, live like there's no tomorrow. And that's a phrase that you often see on posters in people's houses, and it kind of captures this idea. What if everything you knew about the world was turned upside down? You had no inhibitions anymore. You had complete freedom. You had no fear. No one's watching, no one's listening. Just do whatever you like. How would your life be transformed? How would you work? How would you dance? How would you sing? Would your life be different? The original quote from that was actually from Mark Twain, and this is what he said: dance like no one's watching, love like you've never been hurt, sing like nobody's listening, live like it's heaven on earth. Live like it's heaven on earth. And this is what the early followers of Jesus start doing. They start living as if heaven was on earth. Death is no longer the great, terrifying thing at the end of your life. People can come back from the dead. Jesus has conquered death. And so what would it be like to live as if you were kind of living in eternity? So we're going to hear the reading on what happened to these first followers of Jesus.
They spent their time learning from the apostles, and they were like family to each other. They also broke bread and prayed together. Everyone was amazed by the many miracles and wonders that the apostles worked. All the Lord's followers often met together, and they shared everything they had. They would sell their property and possessions and give the money to whoever needed it. Day after day, they met together in the temple. They broke bread together in different homes and shared their food happily and freely while praising God. Everyone liked them, and each day the Lord added to their group others who were being saved.
So, what did these first followers do? They hung out together every day, it says. They ate together, they learned together, they shared what they had with each other, and they looked out for each other. When one was suffering, when one was in trouble, they stopped and helped them. This is what we call the early church, the first gathering of the followers of Jesus. And what I think is really fascinating about this is that these people were the church. They embodied the church. They enacted the church. But most importantly, they didn't just attend church. They were the church. And this, I think, can be a challenge to current cultural understandings of church. There's this long history we've got, which is really hard to shake, that church is a building you go to. All Saints Church, St. Mark's Church, you turn up to church, you attend a church service. I'm going to church. What would it look like if we, like those first followers of Jesus, were the church? We embodied everything about what it means to be the church. And so they provide us with this incredible picture. How do you be the church? And we see that they are encountering this in two really miraculous ways. The first is they're having literal miracles. People are being healed. The apostles are praying for each other. They're seeing people set free from illness, from being sick. But I think the second incredible miracle that we see here is this radical love and generosity they have towards each other. They sold their possessions as anyone had need, and they shared with each other. Now this was really radical in their day as much as it would be in ours. In the Middle East in Jesus' time, there was a really complex system of patronages and indebtedness. You had a really wealthy person with money And you would spend your time kind of doing favours for them, to ingratiate yourself, to make yourself look good to them, so that they would look after you in time of trouble. And this really reinforced people's place in a hierarchy. The wealthy were at the top, and the poorer you were, the further down the hierarchy you were. And so you would be always trying to do a favour for someone in the hope that they could do a favour back. And it was this kind of culture of always trying to curry favour from each other. And really at the end of it, though, there was no escape from this poverty. The hierarchy kind of kept you trapped in desperate circumstances. There was no welfare system. So if you fell on hard times, if there was a drought, a famine, there was nobody to help you to pick up the pieces except this hierarchy of people. So you could easily end up destitute, having to sell yourself as a slave, having to sell your children. And in this, even the wealthy could find themselves in this position. Maybe they got out of favour with the ruling class, with the emperor, and suddenly they too find themselves on hard times. So everyone's always sort of going around trying to figure out where they are in the system and how they can keep making it work for them, trying to curry favour with each other all the time. And here, cutting across this cultural expectation of how you lived, the early church instituted probably one of the first sort of mutual assurance societies, or an insurance kind of club. It's kind of like a precursor to our modern insurance, where you all form a club and you look after each other. They've kind of created a mini welfare state. If one of you is sick, someone who has more will look after you. If one of you falls on hard times, someone with more money will take care of you. So this is a time before the pension or the widow's benefit, and this is what the early church did. They stepped in and they provided those things. There's a man called Jim Wallace, and he has some excellent commentary on this passage. I'm going to refer to him a few times. This is what he says. The coming of the Spirit among these early disciples shattered the old, normal economic assumptions and created an entirely different economic order. A new economy emerged among them. So what happened with them is their dependence on this old order, this exploitative hierarchy, was suddenly dropped, and it gave them huge amount of hope. And I think you can begin to see, Jesus said the greatest laws in all the Bible is to love God with all your heart, soul and mind, and love your neighbour as you love yourself. And here it is, flowering. It's being realised. People are learning how to love their neighbour as they love themselves. Now, there's a danger with this, though. And the danger can be to turn this one response to the risen presence of Jesus, to seeing their leader, their teacher, come back from the dead, the response 2,000 years ago, and say, this is now the rule of what it means to be the church today. This is the guidelines that we must follow, X, Y, and Z. And I think that we need to be very careful that we don't fall into this trap of thinking that this is the same across all times and for all cultures. I went to Australia as a child, and there we encountered a community that was known for its mutual sharing. They all lived close to each other. They had a lot of communal resources, and they were kind of heralded. It was in the 80s. As this was the new model for living. This was how Christians could live their life. And we went and visited them. And I only have one memory of this place. And I think we did church together on Sunday morning. And then what they all did on a Sunday afternoon was swim in their communal pool. And I was really looking forward to this because it was Australia and it was hot. So people were loaning us their togs and we were really looking forward to going for a swim. But then they had their church meeting after their church service, where it was announced that swimming was cancelled that week because one of the teenage boys had dunked an elder in the church under the water the previous week. And I think it happens so often. People go in with these good intentions, we're going to share resources, and it just becomes this prison-like existence of rules and power. And while the exterior might look like they've somehow captured the essence of the church, the reality was this deep shaming and embarrassment for this poor teenage boy, anger from the rest of the community that seemed out of all proportion to what had happened. And we see in the media in New Zealand this happening all the time. I mean, there are plenty of stories of Christian communes or Christian cults where it's just, they might be sharing the resources, but everything else seems all out of whack with exploitation and abuse. So that's not the key, just to take this and say, wow, if we're going to be church, this is what we have to do. It's not really about following a set of black and white rules. So if it's not that, what is it about, and how do we become and enact the church in our day? Jim Wallace again says this: the creation of a new economy in the churches is not going to come about merely through good intentions on our part or that of our congregations, nor do I believe that it will simply come about through good social and economic analysis. It will come about only when we begin to experience something of what the early believers experienced in their own lives. For Jim Wallace, this notion of experience is critical. What did these early followers experience, and what will it give birth to? Why is it that we don't see, some of this radical generosity in our world, in our church? This is what Jim Wallace says: I'm increasingly convinced that it has less to do with ill will or bad intentions. It has more to do with how small our communion with God and with one another really is. How small our communion with God and with one another really is. Most of us in the churches have yet to find the spiritual strength and resources that will enable us to live out our faith. So here's the challenge. How is it that we can become radical, incredibly generous, like the early church, without just having these black and white rules that turn into abusive situations? I remember a while ago, I was really busy, and I knew a whole lot of friends were going through a really hard time, and it was just one of those rough times in life, and I really took some time out, and I spent it praying and reading the Bible and just sort of soaking and trying to commune with God and listening to God. And I remember waking up the next morning, having gone to sleep feeling exhausted and overwhelmed, just with this real sense that these friends of mine that were going through a really tough time, I wanted to do something for them. And they were kind of living in a community, and several of them were going through a tough time. So I made a decision, despite my own tiredness, that I was going to cook. And I think there was about 15 people. So I called them up and I was like, I want to cook for you guys. I want to do this. And they said, okay, well, tomorrow night would work better. So I spent the next day cooking for them all. And this is pretty remarkable and radical because I don't actually really like cooking that much. But it was kind of the sense of love and joy that I think had come from spending that time with God, having my heart made bigger, this encounter and this experience of Jesus' presence in my life. And this is the incredible difference. There was no rule that said to me, this is what you need to do. You need to be cooking and doing this, but it was a sense that came out of this abundance of knowing God's love in my life that led me to do this. And this is a really important thing. In hearing the story of the early church, without the love of God moving us and propelling us forward, without that communion with God, there's nothing. It's just black and white rules. So in this passage, we see that the early church devoted themselves to teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, to prayer. Many signs and wonders were done, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were drawn together by the very force of their fellowship. So let's assume that this is a picture of what it does mean to follow Jesus, to be the church. What are the themes we can look for? If we're not going to look for rules, black and white sets of prescriptions, you've got to follow 1, 2, 3, 4. What are the themes that we could begin to recognise? This is the church at work, where we can look at other gatherings and say we recognise that as the church. It's got those themes, it's got that flavour of that early church. Well, I think there are 3 themes. I want to talk through them. The first theme is that they met together. They were a community. They were drawn to each other. It says they met in the temple courts, they met in each other's homes. And I think that's a really good reminder. It doesn't matter where we meet. We don't have to meet in a church building. We don't have to meet in a sacred space, in a religious space. We can meet in our homes when we're allowed. We can meet over Zoom. We can meet over the phone. The key thing is that these people were meeting together. They wanted to catch up. They wanted to spend time together. And I think this really cuts against some of the themes that are coming through in our culture when it comes to faith and spirituality. And that's pretty much in all kind of faith and spirituality in the Western world. There's kind of the sense it's just about me and my personal journey. And whatever works for me and whatever I'm working through, that's great. And whatever you're doing, that's great. And for Christians, it's just about me and Jesus. It's just about me and my relationship with God. This isn't a picture of the early church. This isn't the flavour of the church embodied. Christianity is a team sport. It's not tennis, where you've got your coach who might be chatting to you online or sending you a message every now and again. You've got a wee support crew, but essentially you go out there and you play on your own. And it's not golf, where you've got a caddy who's going to give you insightful advice and moral support and help you choose the right way to go. But at the end of the day, you're the star. You're the one who's got to face down that ball and your club on your own. It's not about, going into your backyard with a rugby ball and just kicking the ball around by yourself or just shooting hoops by yourself. Christianity is a team sport. It's about the playing together. It's about everybody joining in and participating. I heard this really amazing analogy from a friend, and she said that good church is like going shopping at the grocery store instead of online shopping. Now, she said this before we're all in lockdown, but I think it's even more relevant now. She said, when I do online shopping, I only buy what I need, what I think I need. I've got my list, I go on, I buy the things, and they all come to me. What I've pre-ordered, what I can expect, the things that I want. She said, when I go grocery shopping, I suddenly see all these other incredible things, and I think, I would like that too. Yes, how about that? And add it to the trolley. And she said, this is a little bit like church. When you're alone, when you just get to pick and choose, you think, this is what I need, this is what I'll have. When you go to church, suddenly your mind is open to all manner of extra things. What about this? I'd never thought of that. This is incredible. Look what I can learn from these people. And I find that for me in church, this is what's happened to me. And the Bible says iron sharpens iron. Just like iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. When we gather with others, we are challenged and we can grow. We can learn together. And in our church context, I really appreciate being with people, other parents who have kids with disabilities who are struggling at school. I appreciate the many teachers and professionals who work with kids with disabilities that we can chat to. I have learned a lot about gardening through my church community because we have so many passionate gardeners. And then more than that, I'm challenged constantly about learning to love more, learning to forgive, learning to be generous, learning to be faithful, learning to stick the course. And this is something that I can only learn when I'm rubbing shoulders with people quite different from me, people from different generations. And this is the gift of when people gather. So that's the first theme. The early church was embodied as they met together. They weren't a group of individuals. They were a gathering of people meeting together regularly. The second theme is this. They learnt together. When they gathered together, they learnt and they focused on the apostles' teaching. Now, what were the apostles teaching? About Jesus. When they gathered, they wanted to learn all the more. Tell us more about Jesus. We missed that event where he preached. What did he say? What did he do? When he healed that person, what happened? This was the passion of the group. Tell us more about Jesus. And I think really importantly, this needs to lead to an encounter with Jesus. Last week we met the two companions on the road to Emmaus, and they say as Jesus opens the scriptures and talks to them, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened scriptures to us? When we gather together and we learn from each other, this is not just about our heads. It's not just about stuffing our brains with knowledge about Jesus. We do it for our hearts, that they would burn within us, that we would be transformed, that our encounter with Jesus, as we hear the teaching in the Gospels, what the apostles wrote down for our benefit, would change us and would challenge us. We can encounter Jesus. Our hearts can burn within us as we begin to hear the scriptures being taught, as we learn the apostles' teaching. And theme number 3 is that this early church community cut across cultural expectations. They created this new economy. They went against this hierarchical system that they existed in. They challenged just by their everyday lives the expectations that others had of them. And I think this is probably the hardest thing. When people see us, embodied church, do they look and go, look at how they live? They are so different. It is so inspiring. We want to become part of this incredible group of people. I think this is so hard. But here is the challenge. And in the words of Mark Twain, live like it's heaven on earth. As we meet together, as we begin to encounter Jesus, as we read the gospel stories, how can we begin to live our lives in a way that doesn't just get sucked into the culture around us, that really embodies the values of Jesus, that lives out what it means to be his church? And this isn't just about following those black and white rules. We have to somehow hear Jesus in our context right now and begin to understand, how do we live so we can be like Jesus now? And so here's the invitation for us today. Not just to follow a rigid set of rules from 2,000 years ago, but we need to encounter the risen Christ and to see what happens. What is Christ going to say to us? What are the impulses that move through our hearts? What do we naturally want to do because of that encounter with Jesus? Where are we going to encounter Christ this week? Is it going to be as we read gospel stories? Is it going to be through encounters with other Christians? Is it going to be as we take time out to pray? Let's spend a minute now in prayer and ask Jesus to encounter us this week, to teach us and to lead us so that our hearts might burn within us. Let's pray. Jesus, we need to embody the church in our time, but we don't have a roadmap for that. And you don't give us one because you want us to walk that road with you. You want us to trust you. You want us to listen. You want us to have a living, breathing relationship with you. So we come to you and we trust you, that you'd be speaking to us all as we go through this time where we are in lockdown. May we come out of this with ideas and visions from you of what it means to be the living church in our time and in our place. I pray you would be speaking to us in dreams, in visions, in pictures. May we grasp something of what it means to be your church. Amen.